Welcome, everyone. I'm Dr. Donald Wallenfang. A pleasure to be with you in this live stream entitled Creatio ex Nihilo and the peculiar nature of spiritual being. Thinking more about the question, what is spirit? What is spiritual being? Taking commentary from my 2017 book, Human and Divine Being, a study on the theological anthropology of Edith Stein. So it's a great joy to get to think about these things together. And I want to begin with a question that was posed yesterday from a skeptical observer about the doctrine, the Christian doctrine, the Jewish Christian doctrine of creatio ex nihilo, creation from nothing. The meaning that God creates this universe that we observe, that we know, in terms of microscopic viewpoints, macroscopic viewpoints, that God creates this universe from nothing. That the universe itself is not identical to God, but is other than God. And God is other than the universe. This is the Judeo-Christian belief. Um, Good that you found the name of the saint, Gerard Mahela. Great. Good to hear. I should look him up and learn more about him. So it's always good to learn more about great human beings and thinkers in terms of virtue, in terms of humility, in terms of sincerity, conviction, witness. So, thinking about this doctrine, Creatio ex Nihilo, and that has to do with God creating the world from nothing, that God wills the world into being, God wills the universe into being, at once finite material and spiritual being. God grants the universe being. And I was thinking more about this yesterday. We can think of the nature of finite being is borrowed being. I really like this concept in that there's traces of divinity throughout the universe. As St. Augustine talks about, every bit of finite being serves as a sign pointing to the res as its source. The res, the one really real thing, reality, divinity, being itself, absolute being, pure act upon which all this finite transient being is entirely contingent, entirely held in its being because of the generosity of divine goodness and wanting to share itself with creatures, with these beings who once upon a time had none, like ourselves. So I want to think more about this. And the difference, too, is some of the questions are asking about the difference between Catholic understanding of this doctrine, creation from nothing, as well as eschatological questions. So asking questions not only about origin, but also about end. What will happen when we read what St. Paul, God will be all in all? What does this mean? What is this doctrine within Christianity about theosis, as someone brought up yesterday? Again, it does not mean that the individual finite being is dissolved into divinity or becomes something other than itself. What we have in this Judeo-Christian tradition is not a doctrine of reincarnation, but a doctrine about the integrity of beings in their individuality, in their peculiarity, in their specificity. So thank you for your question. Is spiritual being a contradiction as beings tend to be natural and made of atoms? No, it's not. And I'd invite you, thank you for your question, Travis. A few of my previous live streams where I start getting into the question, what is spirit? What is spiritual being? But spirit is something by definition immaterial. So we can think about what kind of being exists that is not made of atoms. Is there something necessary to exist first before there can be formed matter? And this we say, yes, there is. What Aristotle calls a formal cause of a being. So there's matter, but there's also a form, and form determines what the atoms are doing, participating in this form we call human, in that form called penguin, in this other form called mosquito, in this other form earthworm, in this other form a crab or a bacteria. What causes matter to participate in this very distinctive form and that very distinctive form and this other one? It is form. It is what we call objective spiritual being. Objective spiritual being determines the actual shape, character, kind of specific beings in this finite universe. So there are, yes, we're not defying the principle of non-contradiction, but what we have to do in asking the question of being is expand our hermeneutic horizon. If from the start I say nothing can exist except those kinds of being that are made up of atoms. If we already set parameters on the real from the start, we could be unfair to reality and be missing a whole bunch of it. So this is how can we really just define something into being? You don't see how. It's not that we're defining something into being. We are, through this philosophical method of phenomenology, we're trying to simply observe and receive what gives in the course of our lived experience. And much more gives itself than atoms. Much more gives itself than bodies and a world of objects. What gives itself, especially for us human beings, are things like meanings, meaningfulness, ideas, affectivity, something like love, something like the meaning of gift, which can't be reduced to the interplay of atoms. We so often in empirical methods of investigation take for granted the spiritual observer. And because we as spiritual observers have bodies, we can tend to reduce ourselves to our bodies. But this is unfair to reality. So I want to talk further about how we can tell. And you see, in your language, in your question, why can't physical feelings in a physical brain reduce to atoms? This is precisely what we do not want to do in philosophy. Reduce, reductionism. So we're going to get into something much more vast than empiricism. Though empiricism has its place within human experience, our experience, we have much more data than measurable ones, than quantifiable ones. So we're looking for other kinds of evidence, not just material kinds of evidence. So let me give you a piece of evidence called love, called meaning. What do we have to do with these? So much. The reason we care about anything. So desire, ideas, geometric forms. There's a geometric form circle that precedes the wheel, that precedes the frisbee. Uh, yes, so let's keep thinking about this together. But I want to, again, piggyback on a great question from yesterday from a skeptical observer who's asking about this doctrine, creation from nothing. And the nature of divinity within this doctrine is wholly other than anything within this finite universe. And so I want to read a quote from Edith Stein's book, Potency and Act. If you haven't gotten a chance to spend time in this book, I highly recommend it, as well as her even more developed work called Finite and Eternal Being. The author is Edith Stein. It's very amazing work here. And I want to quote again from Potency and Act, where she says that philosophy based on natural reason brings us to the act of creation, which alone is able to bridge the gulf between being and non-being. between being and non-being, to leap from spirit to matter. But here philosophy halts before a locked gate, namely creation. What we mean by creation, and specifically creation from nothing, as taught by faith, as taught by divine revelation in relation to reason, which is a revelation entirely rational. Creation remains a mystery for our knowledge, not that it doesn't have its evidence, but the event of Creatio ex Nihilo itself cannot be accessed directly. What is absolutely spiritual and actual calls into being its direct opposite. What is non-spiritual and potential, namely matter. Uh, and so thank you for your comments, your questions, but I want to rise to the challenge to give an apologetic for this doctrine, Creatio ex Nihilo, thinking about matter in relation to spirit, and spirit in relation to matter. So we want to bring these two things together. And if we're talking about reliability, again, this has to do with epistemological conditions for possibility of reliability. So if from the start we're saying all that can exist is in the box that I determine ahead of time, this is not fair to what might give itself through the course of lived experience. And what we have in religious experience, um, is that what we have here is something other than empirical data. We have other kinds of data, other kinds of givenness, kinds of experiences that do not permit themselves to be reduced. So, again, if we're going to dialogue, we have to do so respectfully. If we get disrespectful, then we can't dialogue. So this is already an important point. We need to proceed with sincerity, with openness, with open investigation. If we want to just laugh at the position of the other, we're not serious about the truth. But if you're serious about the truth, we need to take time to listen to each other and think further than we've thought before. Because if you're asking, what is spirit? You want to know more about it, and it takes time to think about it. If you want to reduce the thought process to the typical empirical or the tropes of empiricism, we're not going to get very far thinking about spirit and spiritual being. So let's keep thinking together about the real, yes, reality. And you ask about imagination. Imagination has something to do with reality, as Immanuel Kant talks about. There's nothing that we can imagine that in some way we haven't already experienced. We synthesize essences from experience within imagination. So imagination does not produce something considered real before having received the givenness of the real prior to the activity of imagination. So, creatio ex nihilo. Philosophy must halt before this locked gate of the doctrine of creation. We cannot access that event directly. We can only speculate about it. Nobody can go back to the beginning and be a direct observer of the beginning. All we have to work with are all these effects, this universe of secondary causes and effects that we reason above all through classical metaphysics to the first cause, that upon which is everything else is contingent. So what is absolutely spiritual and actual, that we call divinity, yes, that we call God, calls into being its direct opposite. What is non-spiritual and potential, what we call atoms, pieces of matter, subatomic particles. Again, if what we're after here is a certain kind of knowledge that is confining itself to empiricism alone, if we're saying I'm only going to think empirically in terms of mass energy, and that's all the grammar I'm going to use. That's all of the concepts I'm going to use. I'm going to stick to the natural sciences alone: chemistry, biology, physics, and accompanying ones in anatomy, physiology. If one says this is I'm predetermining in advance the real based on this grammar, these kinds of evidence, and I'm not going beyond it, that's a epistemological decision to make at the front end of things. And it has to do with if you're taking aim at a target from the start, that it's a hermeneutic circle. You will end up at no other place than that target at which you take aim. However, if you expand at least the possibility of data as they want to give themselves within lived experience from the start, like a scientist who is not already coming to the experiment with everything figured out, but instead wants to receive the data as they give themselves, then we will take much time to calibrate the shot from the start, and in fact take many kinds of shots at many kinds of targets according to the data that give themselves within lived experience. So the main difference here in terms of knowledge is if I reduce the possibilities of knowledge to only certain types, certain kinds, sense data, for example. If I leave it at there's no other data except sense data, empirical data, having to do with material objects, then I'm I'm closing the frame. I'm zooming in on reality in one type of way, to the detriment of the panorama that reality actually is. So yes, we have so many targets. We have so much work to do in philosophy. So this we want to do. And no, I'm not claiming that we can't sense God, but the question is, how do we sense God? How do we sense God? How do we understand sense itself? So let me share one more quote from Edith Stein and keep building this discursive reasoning, this rational demonstration. For no natural knowledge of God, Stein writes, ascending from creatures, discloses his hidden nature or essence. All such natural knowledge, despite the analogy by which creature and creator are linked, can comprehend him only as the totally other. So if we begin with a concept of God that is reducible to something familiar like an object, we're not getting at the Judeo-Christian idea of God. God, by definition, is wholly other. And this is a key point for philosophy. We must continue to make room for alterity, for otherness within our thought process. Within the itinerary of reason itself, where is reason going? Only back to what it already knows? Or is inquiry, is investigation reaching for something it has not yet made contact with? This is divinity, always divinity. Divinity itself supplies the reach, supplies the rational space to go further than you've gone before. And so if we just run like a hamster in a wheel in this hermeneutic circle we call empiricism, or even rationalism, reason is self-imploding. So I'm not trying to define God into existence. I'm calling into question my own existence and asking, where did it come from? What is the cause? My intention is not to make God exist, but my intention is to raise the question of existence itself in terms of cause and effect. So we want to keep the question open. We want to let the horizon continue to expand as we think about these things. Okay, so let's continue to think with Edith Stein, raising the question of creation, Creatio ex nihilo, creation from nothing. We begin with this. And, what's interesting, I appreciate the activity in the chat, Travis and Bert. This is a great interaction. But the way we need to think philosophically is to give a little more space for thought, I think, because it's hard to answer one question when they keep on firing. So we're not talking about the God of the gaps theory here. I'm not looking for God to fill a gap. I'm looking to understand reality in its fullness, not in terms of here's a gap that needs to be filled, but in terms of the whole, the cohesive network of being itself. And my knowledge, there's a cusp. I'm always learning more. And yes, at the same time, I can realize and admit so much that I don't know, so much I still have yet to learn. But if we approach God with such haste, if we approach the question of being, the question of divinity with such haste, then uh, we don't do it justice. We need to slow down the questions and ask one at a time, and uh, and just think together. So I invite you in the live stream, not just to challenge me before I can speak a paragraph, but to think along together. If you let me just say some things, and then you can respond, and then we can have a discussion, a dialogue. So this is the best way, I think, to go about it. Okay, so what is matter? Let's start there with maybe some common ground. Matter was what fills space, is time bound, and is, we say in metaphysics or ontology, ontologically in potentia. Matter is in potentia. Every bit of matter. We learn this from Albert Einstein in the mass energy equivalence equation. E equals mc squared. Let's think about this a bit together. E equals mc squared. Does anyone want to dispute that straight away? Okay. So let's think about this. Does anyone want to challenge Einstein's mass energy equivalence equation? Energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. Okay, I don't see any challenge to this equation. But let's think about it in terms of it, we don't need to call each other names. I'm not a flat earther. I'm very much serious about the real, both in terms of empiricism, but beyond empiricism, metaphysics, phenomenology, these philosophical methods that get at the whole beyond what natural science is capable of. Okay, so what we have here through this formula, uh, we have the recognition, and we see this in natural phenomena, that mass is convertible into energy. Every star is doing this through the process of nuclear fusion, where, for instance, these hydrogen atoms are crashing into each other, colliding into each other, and emitting thermal radiant energy, heat and light, that makes Earth possible, for example. And so we see mass is convertible into energy. In nuclear particle accelerators, we see how energy is convertible into mass. These are convertible one into the other. Every speck of mass or matter is mutable. It's undergone millions of changes. It will still undergo millions of changes. There's no stable particle in the observable material, physical universe. There's no stable particle, not the proton, the neutron, the electron. They're all morphing, constantly morphing one into the other. And we learn about this through particle physics. In fact, these subatomic particles are made up of even smaller ones, like quarks, leptons, gauge bosons. All these particles of the particles at the most micro level. Everything is defined by change in the observable universe. But something undergoing change is not uh, itself the cause of the change. It's being changed by something else, changed by another. And in the case of chemistry, atoms, molecules, elements, they're being changed by what's nearby, by the interaction with energy and mass in the local environment. There is no particle of matter that is not subject to change, that hasn't already changed, and is not susceptible to ongoing change and definitely will continue to change. So the observable universe in terms of matter, or what we call physical universe, is defined by change, mutability, transience. So if this is the case, what makes all these kinds of being, both large and small, remain in being, in substantial being, through the course of time, temporality? How could I remain the same for over 40 years of living? What causes me to remain the same while my body is radically changing over the course of time? Um, so, what is the cause of a being remaining what it is over the course of time? And this has to do with the distinction between matter. Even take a proton, even take a hydrogen atom, the first element on the periodic table, which a stable hydrogen atom, not an isotope, would be one proton, one electron. Then we get into helium and start having the neutrons and protons in the nucleus, electrons. But matter is potency. Every speck of matter could participate in this form or that form. A hydrogen atom, carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, these, especially the elements that are involved in biological organisms, it doesn't matter to them what form they participate in. But what determines the form they participate in? What makes a penguin, a human, a camel, a rock, a blade of grass, a maple tree, a cloud, water. What makes these forms adhere over the course of time? And if the meta-narrative of natural science is everything is moving toward a state of thermal equilibrium, and entropy defines the observable material universe, then what is ordering the chaos? Why don't we just get on with it and contribute to that frozen atomic soup we call the thermal equilibrium, which is very cold? Why don't we just expedite the process? But instead, why do we maintain such beautiful, symmetrical, rational, personal form? What is the cause? Not matter. Do we want to give the periodic table of elements credit for our personal spiritual being? I don't think so. That's absurd. We have an entirely different aspect of reality, and we call it form. And form is not made of atoms. Form is what determines the shape the atoms take, both in terms of the microparticles and the macro instantiations of being, like plants, an animal, a rock, a star. So it is this formal causality that gives shape to the matter, molds the matter. And for us personal spiritual beings, what is the form of human being specifically? In terms of spirit, we say it is the soul, and it is the form that is the act in relation to the potency that becomes actualized by the act acting upon it. And this is the difference between cause and effect. And matter does not cause itself, but it relies on a prior cause to be what it is, to participate in the form it's participating in, at least for a time, over this course of time. And so we have act acting on potency that brings about an effect we call a being, an individual being, an instance of being, at least semi-stable for a time, between the no longer of the past and the not yet of the future. This constant unfolding of every individual finite being that is comprised of these two main components, matter and form. And this goes back to Aristotle in his doctrine we call hylomorphism, from the Greek word for matter, hule, and the Greek word for form, in this case, morphe. Hylomorphism. Every individual being has its respective matter and form. You can look at my CV online to see the work I've done in publishing and presenting. It's been several things. But I've always been fascinated, like you, with this world of natural science, as well as spiritual being in relation to matter. This is what we're thinking about with Edith Stein. I've peer-reviewed many papers. If you find my CV, you'll see all the various journals and things. So here we go. Is prime matter an independent principle, or a tricky question? I'll leave it to you to look at my resume. But prime matter is a pure theoretical idea, a pure theoretical concept. We don't find the reality of prime matter except as a theoretical concept. Prime matter itself is the most empty concept there is, almost equivalent to that of nothing. But prime matter on this spectrum between form and matter, prime matter would be the extremity of what we mean by matter and potency. In other words, unformed matter is what's meant by prime matter. But we have no piece of matter in reality that in some way is not formed. So for matter to actually exist, it needs to come with form. It needs to be formed. The difference between the proton, the neutron, and electron, they're not all the same kind, they're not all the same particle. The difference between helium, hydrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, carbon, nitrogen, and so on, they're not all the same element because of the number of protons, electrons, and neutrons within the atoms that make up that element. So every instance of matter has form, whether very small or very large. To the largest star has a form that is imposed on the matter, a form to which the particles themselves must conform to exist. So we have matter and we have form. And if we gloss over the category of form in relation to matter, we're not thinking fully to the whole of the reality of being and what makes up being: matter and form, potency and act. So prime matter is the extremity of what we mean by potency without form. But the extremity to this is the most real we can get within the question of being, and it is pure act. Pure act without any admixture of potency, and this is divinity. This is God, being itself, what we mean by existence. The essence or nature or substance of divinity is existence itself, being in act, actual being in a verbal sense. And this is not speculation. This is the metaphysical necessary condition of possibility for there to be this world of change, for there to be this observable world of E equals mc squared. All of this needs to be held in being by something that itself is not undergoing change, that is not contingent or dependent on anything else. And this original cause, itself not caused, this original mover, itself not moved by anything else, in which its essence is the very act of being, what we call existence, that we get the privilege of participating in, at least for a time, if not into eternity, which I think we may all hope that would be the case. This uncaused cause, this unmoved mover, is who we call God, divinity. And God is no effect of anything else. But if this observable universe itself is full of effects, and we cannot find one piece of matter that is not an effect of something else, that is not caught up in the flux of change and mutability, if this is the truth about the observable universe, then intellectually this demands us crediting the existence of all of this mutable universe to being itself, that is by definition immaterial, immutable, what we call by way of analogy spirit, pure spirit, divinity. It is the intellectual exigency. One can resign to agnosticism and say, I don't want to go there because my thought process is going to be confined to empirical grammars, methods of experimentation, certain types of evidence. Okay, but if you want to be a philosopher, you have to go there. If you want to dare to philosophize, you have to risk everything and think toward the whole and let the whole take you up into its saturating content. And so, yes, philosophy, we do speculate, but it is rational speculation. If we say there's no room for speculation, what we're left with is pragmatism and ideology. And there's there's certain questions that are not allowed to be asked there. And that is a scary world to live in. No, this is rational. This is entirely rational. So let's continue to think with this. What's wrong with no theology? Okay, let me answer that question. What's wrong with no theology? I want to answer it in a philosophical way, first of all, as a kind of meeting ground. And anyone else can chime in the chat too to answer such a question. What's wrong with no theology? Okay. Yeah, we can keep thinking about prime matter too. Thank you for these comments. So let's take the term theology. If we cut to the chase and we say, you say, what's wrong with no theology? Well, to say that, we're going to throw out two very important things for being human and for rational thoughts. Getting back to the Greek origin of the word, we have theos, where we would translate, yes, God. And then logos, where we get the English word logic, related to the Latin ratio, and we get the English reason. And I'll just say science. Science itself, asking questions, coming to precise knowledge about things. And if you say Why do we have to have theology within our philosophy or related to philosophy, or why does philosophy have to go to questions about God? Because by the word God in philosophy, before talking about any particular kind of divine revelation, with the word God comes the concept of the infinite. So if we want to exterminate theology from thought, we exterminate the concept of the infinite, because for philosophy, God signifies the concept of the infinite. And so if you say, I want to have philosophy without theology, but still have the concept of the infinite, then you let God back into philosophy. So what we mean by God is infinite being, uncaused being, being itself. And if you want to cancel theology, then yes, we do away with the Latin concept esse, being itself. Ipsum esse subsistens, self-subsisting being itself. If we want to do away with theology, we also do away with the concept of otherness. Otherwise than you, otherwise than human, otherwise than earth, otherwise than the universe. We curtail the concept of otherness if we want to prohibit theology from thought. So we lose the infinite, we lose being itself, we lose otherness, we lose the concept of the absolute for philosophy, of pure simplicity, of all the things that God signifies, even before we're talking about a personal God or God as creator. We're losing so much intellectual content if we prohibit theology from thought. Um, and what else we're going to lose without theology, I would suggest, is ethics. Because who determines the laws? Who determines what is right and wrong? If God is not the author of being, if God is not goodness itself, who's left to take God's place? Us. And how have we done with that? In the various totalitarian regimes where this happens with the eclipse of God, it's entirely destructive. So if we're serious about ethics, if we're serious about love and responsibility, we need the concept of divinity. Because left to our own resources, they're entirely finite, limited, in the end, bankrupt. Because what ounce of being can we claim credit for, even for ourselves? We can't. We're not the cause of ourselves. Mother Nature is not the cause of us. Atoms in the periodic table of elements is not the cause of us, personal, rational beings. We have something else going on with us. And this we want to think about rationally. So we don't in any way want to prohibit theology or any ology for that matter, because we're serious about reason, we're serious about the truth, we're serious about being precise concerning the data that we don't invent, but that give themselves within our lived experience. And so we don't want to lose ethics, we don't want to lose love, we don't want to lose responsibility for the other. Because if we reduce everything to finitude, someone might say, I can be quits with the other at some point. So this is what we would lose if we want to dare to excise theology from thought. Am I implying that atheists cannot be ethical or loving? No, actually, because you still have the word theos in the word atheist. You still deal with God, and you still have faith. It's in the form of doubt. You can't prove to yourself that God doesn't exist. You can doubt that God exists. And I can prove to myself that God exists. I have faith that God exists because God, by definition, is something I can't perfectly comprehend, like a world of objects. So the atheist also has faith, and it's in the form of doubt. The atheist never will stop dealing with God because God gives. God gives the question of God. God gives the concept of God. God gives the possible relationship with God. God gives God's self, yes, as evidence. God shows up in the terrain of our common lived experience. And we all have a response to make from the evidence, either to believe or not to believe. But we share this common fate, to use that word, of having to make a decision. And in one form or another, the die will be cast. And so we do gather up the evidence, not just the evidence about atoms and elements, but evidence about meaning and love and responsibility and of a fullness of truth that exceeds the capacities of delimitation. The greatest prize for philosophy is to continue to think toward the infinite, toward the excess, toward the exorbitant. Because, even practically speaking, if I want to love best, I need to study the best of lovers. If I want to be the most ethical being I can be, I want to pursue an ethics in which I recognize a call of the other without cessation that goes on into eternity because it proceeds from it. What we're talking about here in philosophy is finite and eternal being, not just finite being. Because, at the very least, the concept of the infinite gives itself. This is something Rene Descartes recognized. And he confessed the truthfulness of the infinite because it gives itself as a concept while we ourselves are not it. We're clearly not it. So we let, in philosophy, we let our concepts, we let these saturating concepts continue to confront us, and we wrestle with them. So another question, an intuition due to our evolutionary lineage, or is there more to it? So if a biological being is evolving, which yes, we have plenty of evidence to show in the natural sciences that biological organisms evolve over the course of time and adapt to their local environments. But if an organism is evolving, it presupposes that there is an end or a goal or a purpose toward which the organism evolves. And such a goal or purpose, we would say, we would call life. Or organism evolves so as to live better, to live longer, to perpetuate the species eventually. One individual member of a species will die to make room for the other to take its place. Will give the gift of life very naturally, all these animal species that do so instinctively. But that toward which everything is evolving is what we call in philosophy and metaphysics the final cause of all the evolution, all the development going on. We don't have evolution if we don't have an end game, an end cause, if we don't have this pull toward which a being evolves. Likewise, we don't even have a being to speak of if there's not a formal cause that awakens it into being as a this or a that. So let's keep thinking then with Edith Stein about spiritual being in relation to matter. What is the difference? On yesterday's live stream, I started to speak about this. And this is another reason we need theology, Because without theology, we lack the fullness of what we mean by both exteriority and interiority. So I want to speak again about the difference between in and out, inside and outside, interiority and exteriority. So when we ask the question of being, we're not just asking a question as to what's out there in the world. In philosophy, we also call into question the one raising the questions about things. Who is the one raising the questions about the world out there? So the world out there implies a world in here, the interiority of the ego, the self, what we mean by a self, the inquirer, the philosopher, um, the proximate cause of culture. We see evidence of the spiritual interiority of persons like ourselves in what we call culture. Everything that makes up culture is evidence of spiritual subjectivity or subjective spiritual being. Whereas out has to do with exteriority, typically thought of as this world of objects. This world of objects that faces me, that gives itself to me, we say in phenomenology. All this world that gives itself to me and the interiority of myself, my conscious life. My conscious life cannot be reduced to empirical investigation, to neuroscience, neurochemistry, neurobiology, anatomy, physiology. But what I experience my personhood doing is a synthesis and an integration of this whole world that gives itself to me, that I integrate and make sense of through what Thomas Aquinas calls my agent intellect, that is the spiritual soul that organizes all of these meanings, thanks to the medium of the body and the medium of the brain. But these anatomical and physiological parts of the person are medium and not themselves the self, the human self. So we have this givenness to the self, and what we're investigating with spiritual being is the interiority of being, not just thinking being outside, out there, and an exteriority of being that is manifest through the plasticity and of the surface areas of material objects that we can weigh and measure, we can dissect. Okay, yes, this is part of the whole, but it's a part. But what we want to do is to describe the one who is doing the describing, to explain and find satisfactory definitions of the investigator himself or herself. Spiritual being is a function of interiority, not exteriority. What we mean by spirit, by an individual finite spirit, in terms of, and you'd have to watch my live stream from the past couple of sessions on the distinction between objective spiritual being and the subjective spiritual being. But what subjective spiritual being has to do with inwardness, interiority in relation to outwardness and exteriority. If there is in world of exteriority, and who would deny this, that the self faces, what about the world of interiority of the self? This is what we want to investigate. So it involves what phenomenology calls a bracketing and conversion of the natural attitude, even with this overwhelming presumption and taking for granted the spiritual subject doing the investigation. We always take for granted the self. And we want to treat the spiritual self like a material object over and over because we're unable to allow our natural attitude, our outlook, our certain hermeneutic position facing the world to undergo critique. We say, no, I'm going to be not susceptible to any critique. I don't want to risk inverting my optic from looking out there to looking in here. And when I say in here, I'm not just talking about the internal viscera of the body. I'm talking about the spiritual core of the self, which again is a necessary condition of possibility for there to be a body that maintains form, that grows and develops over time, that follows the program of the entelechy, as Aristotle calls it, that unfolds over the course of time. I'm not going to treat myself like an object. And if I want to do so, not only will I treat myself like an object, but the other person who faces me like an object. And when I turn persons into objects, I use them. Inevitably. That's what is wrong with a reductionistic empirical view of reality. I reduce everything to a material object. And therefore, as a self, that I don't investigate enough my interiority, my spirituality, my spiritual being. I gloss over that. I deny it. I treat myself like an object. I treat the other like an object. And there we're stuck in a worldview of utilitarianism. And what happens to ethics then? Is there any room for love? And if there is room for love, tell me, what is love if not an activity of spirit? So with Edith Stein, we're getting at what love is. What love is. What love is, what spirit is. Love depends on spiritual being. Spiritual being, by definition, is non-spatial, yes, invisible to the eye, and intangible. It is not a question here of just another sense datum. And if we want to reduce reality to a world of sense data, we still have to keep asking the question, who is doing this sensing? Who is integrating all the data and understanding their meaning? Is meaning itself reducible to the interplay of atoms? I don't think so. So to quote Edith Stein from her book, Finite and Eternal Being, a tremendous book. While the material thing fills space in such a way that every part of the space completely coincides with the part of the thing is not wholly at any particular point, but is spread out with its total being and is as such sensorially manifest. Okay, so this is how we understand matter, how we understand mass. A material thing as object fills space in such a way that every part of it coincides completely with every part of the space that it fills, that it occupies, and that the material thing is not fully itself at any point, at any micro point of its object, but the self of the object involves the whole thing as spread out in its total being as it is sensorially manifest. So something like this water bottle. I can call it a water bottle, not because of this speck of it or that speck of it, in which case it would not be a water bottle, but it too has form because human beings came up with the form to assign to the matter, and they did so very cleverly and invented this particular kind of Yeti water bottle and this particular color scheme and with its plastics, its metals, and so it maintains its form. But once upon a time, it did not exist, just like you and I. But here it is, and we talk about it as an object. As an object, the water bottle It is defined in terms of its totality occupying space in every part of its three-dimensionality. Um, because of all of the various parts that make it up, I can say this is a water bottle. And so this too shows the relationship between form and matter. It's not formless matter. It's not reducible to atoms, but the thing itself, even as object, depends on a more macro level of interpretation in which we understand the atoms to be participating in a greater form that has its surface area, that has its boundaries, that has its limits that we're calling water bottle here. And so it is with every object, and it is sensorially manifest. But spiritual being, yeah, the water bottle has something to do with spirit in terms of objective spirits. That is, an objective form gave it shape, making it what it is in space time. So the form imposed on the matter was actually carried out by subjective spiritual beings working with objective spiritual beings like ideas and concepts and meanings, and beginning with the architecture of water bottle before causing the matter to take shape in this way that maintains a semi-permanence within this observable universe. But spiritual being is of a different order than an object. So it is necessary to invert the gaze to detect, decipher, recognize spiritual being. This I talked about in previous live streams, that a different logic is required than the typical one, than one that is led by the conatus essendi, than one that always asks, what's in it for me? A different kind of logic called the logic of the cross, the science of the cross, the logic of the double negative, which is very paradoxical, not contradictory, but paradoxical. And so what we need to do to detect spiritual being is to invert the hermeneutical disposition. Instead of looking out there, out there, we have to turn and look inside of the self. We have to investigate the self, not self as body, reducible to atoms, reducible to biological processes, what's going on in each individual cell. No, we have a coordination of parts here that exceeds an exterior analysis, though this is a great part of it. But the part we tend to neglect is this interior one. If we want to know what is spiritual being, we have to totally invert the empirical gaze that only looks out and instead look within. Look within the self, the interiority of the self, the interiority of personhood. So Edith Stein says, spiritual being is a being in itself. Sein in sich selbst, a being in itself. Spiritual being is a being in itself. There is something of act in spiritual being that perpetuates it, that allows there to be a stable self over the course of time for us human beings, over the course of human development, something that keeps us stable, an actuality in relation to the potentiality of the body that is causing it to develop toward the full telos, end goal purpose of the organism. And not only in terms of biology and the materiality of the body, but also in terms of the spiritual soul, also unfolds over the course of time. But what is the anchoring substance of the person is the spiritual core we call the soul. The spiritual has inwardness, in a sense entirely foreign to spatial material elements. And when the subjective spiritual, the person, steps forth and communicates himself or herself aus sich herausgehen, when the spiritual subject steps forth to communicate him or herself, just like we're doing here, back and forth, we're communicating with each other, and this is a spiritual act. We're rationally communicating with each other, and this is a spiritual act. We're ethically communicating with each other. That has something to do with eternity and eternal accountability and eventual judgment of the spiritual rational creature. Yes. With no theology, there's no accountability in relation to eternity. So this is why we need it. So the spiritual is, in a sense, inward, entirely foreign to spatial material elements. And when we communicate and do this by diverse ways, either by turning toward objects in what Edmund Husserl calls the intentionality of subjectivity, the intentionality of consciousness, the intentionality of the spiritual life, indeed, or by a purely spiritual self-disclosure to other spirits. You could know, for example, that I am a human being. You could know what I am, metaphysically what I am, by looking at me, listening to me, even through the screen. But you can't know who I am unless I reveal myself to you. That self-revelation of the person is evidence of spiritual being. Yes, there it is. The self-revelation of the person. This purely spiritual self-disclosure, not to the marker because it could never receive my self-disclosure. It is not alive, and it is not an example of subjective spiritual being. But if I reveal myself to you, together we have the potentiality to know each other personally through a sympathetic mutual entering into each other spiritually, or by forming into space our bodies. Spiritual being, the soul as the form of the body, informs the body, and by acting as a formative molding of the foreign material elements when we eat and when we drink, and all of this, it is ultimately the spiritual soul that coordinates this matrix of chemical processes that we study through anatomy and physiology, and continues to give the body form and shape, and above all, life, and a stability of individual being through the course of the flux of temporality, the flux of time, and all these various changes. Spiritual being, a subjective spiritual being, through all the course of these material changes of the body, nonetheless remains in itself. It remains in itself, incommunicable, that is unrepeatable, non-transferable, entirely unique, entirely special. The self, the subjective spiritual self, remains in itself, remains who he is, who she is over the course of time, in spite of all of this vast, ongoing material development of the body and change and accident and disability. None of this affects the stable reality of the spiritual core of the person. This is what Stein is getting at. From its own vital center, a subjective spiritual being forms itself, unifying everything that it is and everything that it appropriates. And this kind of appropriation is once more an exclusive potentiality of the spiritual. The appropriation, this is the Heideggerian Ereignis, the event of meaning. Ereignis, the appropriation of meaning by the spiritual self. This appropriation of meaning, this appropriation of matter, for the purposes of the self, And yes, when it comes to inanimate objects like markers and water bottles and rags, we appropriate the matter according to our spiritual determination. Because our spiritual selves remain what they are, as they are, because they possess, by virtue of their spiritual being, interiority. They're not just a function of exteriority, but we have the eventfulness of being happening, as it were, from the inside out. Even the Catholic priests' theory of the beginning of the universe, we call the Big Bang, Georges Lemaitre, has this kind of character to it. A beginning, a cause that emanates 360 degrees in every direction from the inside out. From the inside out. And we human beings, the privileged observers we are in this currently known material physical universe, we ask these questions from the inside. We don't just trade on empirical sense data. The observer that I am, the thinker that I am, the philosopher that I am, the lover that I am, the believer that I am, proceeds from the inside of me. This is what we're getting at. Personhood. Okay, so let me try to catch up some on the chat. Thank you so much for your participation. Again, I'm not trying to prove spiritual being in the same way I would prove that this marker is an object here in my hand. It's of a different order. Spiritual being constantly proves itself in our humanity. That we're interacting with the world out there implies the interiority of the self, who's doing the observing, who's doing the interacting, who's doing the interrogation, who's doing the speculation, who thinks he or she is proving something to himself. This is so interesting. What we mean by proof is simply the satisfaction of predetermined conditions of possibility for just that. So, what do you mean by proof? You've already determined the conditions of the possibility of proof. But when I'm talking about spirit, perhaps what I'm saying, what I'm pointing to in reality, exceeds the predetermined conditions of possibility for so-called proof, that you are confining to a world of objects. Because spirit is not a matter of object, it's not a matter of atoms or elements. And the fact that we imagine something is due to spirit. So imagination is not a scapegoat for the lack of proof. Imagination is involved in proving something to ourselves. Immanuel Kant talks about this synthetic imagination, which is required in every act of observation and knowledge and understanding and so-called articulation of proof. So you can't peel away from spirit. Every act of communication is another evidence of spirit. That's what we're getting at. So yeah, I hear a lot of comments about Platonism here, and Plato is very important in Plato's very important in this apologetic of spiritual being. In Plato's Academy, on the door it read, "Let no man ignorant of geometry enter." And so, let's see. I'm trying to find an object. Okay, how about this? Book. What shape is this? What shape is this book? I suspect you are learning, and I thank you for your participation and interest. because I suspect there's a passion in you for the truth and you're wrestling with it. And that's why you stay with it. Me too. Me too. Thank you, Reflective Journey. Yeah, we do need a balance between critique and learning. I talked about this on yesterday's live stream. Okay, the shape of this is a rectangle. Yes, we call this a rectangle, the shape of this book, rectangle. How did it get to be in this shape? The form preceded it. And the spiritual subjects who determined the book is going to be in the form of the rectangle. We're working with the spiritual object we call rectangle in geometry. And there can be many different proportions of rectangle. But in general, we have the spiritual form rectangle as such in a Platonic sense. And what's even more real than the book, the material instantiation of the rectangle, is the formal rectangle upon which the matter conforms. So for Plato, what's most real are the forms in terms of morphe, in terms of eidos in the Greek, where we get the English word idea. So an idea is not made of atoms. An idea is real, but an idea is a spiritual object that a spiritual subject is dealing with. Atoms don't think themselves. Impersonal atoms don't give rise to personal spiritual beings. Spiritual act gives rise to persons. Yes, to the course of an evolutionary lineage of being, but in the end, what we are, personal spiritual subjects. So, good. Okay, I'm catching up with the chat. Yes, I would suggest that the atoms and the electrons operative in our brains serve as a medium to transmit the spiritual ideas one to the other as spiritual subjects. What interest would the atoms have in transmitting ideas if the very nature of matter wants to proceed to chaos in any case and just get on toward the thermal equilibrium? If entropy and chaos is the natural end of matter, why resist? Why does life resist death? Why, as rational persons, do we want to resist hate? Do we want to resist nothingness? Do we want to resist the lack of love? Why resist? What is the causality that resists the resistance to order, to peace, to differentiation of being? What is this miracle? Miracle of life. Why life and not life? Why something and not nothing? From whence does this something proceed, and to whither is it going? So again, in the discourse, I would keep pointing to the reductionistic tendencies that we can fall into in our discourse. And yes, the Bible is a library of books, of testimonies over many centuries that includes the whole drama of human experience, both good and bad. To say Bible doesn't mean everything in this account is good and happy, but it's real, and it gets us to hope in the midst of despair. It gets us toward hope and healing in the midst of suffering. It gets us to things like this revelation of God above all in Jesus of Nazareth, to the possibilities of forgiveness, to the possibilities of reconciliation, the possibilities of love. So this is what we find in something like a religious tradition, especially I would say Christianity, and it's entirely valuable for our humanity. So again, if we want to call something real, we have to let it give itself. Reality is not what I determine it to be, especially according to finite parameters of being. Reality for philosophy is something that is perpetually saturating. Reality proceeds from the whole, which I am not. I am a part. I am very small in relation to this whole, but I want to think it by letting it be thought in me, not prohibiting ways it could or could not be thought in me. So that's what we're doing here with Edith Stein. Yes, the human soul is real, and that's what we're talking about here with spiritual being. And I'm going to have to wrap up the live stream here in just a couple minutes for today. But I really delight in the conversation, in the question from a skeptical observer that kicked off this conversation about the doctrine of creation from nothing, both in terms of origin and end, and how we understand individual subjective spiritual being in relation to material being and in relation to divinity, given this doctrine of Creatio ex Nihilo in the Judeo-Christian tradition, which regards divinity as totally other than the universe. Not a part of the universe, not the universe itself, as in pantheism, which yesterday I talked about as a contradiction of terms. But divinity, by definition, is wholly other than finite creaturely being. So how is no? It's not that God was created from nothing. God creates from nothing. So we have to attribute everything that's undergoing change to being itself that is not subject to change, not subject to any alteration or shadow caused by change, to quote the letter of St. James in the Christian New Testament. We have to have a first principle, a first cause, an origin, an originator, in relation to everything else that did not originate itself. So there is something rather than nothing, and this means there's always something rather than nothing. But it doesn't make sense to say the something that always is always changing, because to change means to move from cause to effect. And we have to have an uncaused cause that is not itself the effect of anything else. This we call God, this we call divinity, this we call absolute being itself. So in metaphysics, we think the ontological difference, the difference between beings, finite beings, a world of objects, but also a world of finite spiritual beings, whether angel or human. And I will be talking about angels coming up in future live streams. But the difference between beings and being itself, existence itself, which is common to everything that has existence, but is not the essence of every finite instance of existence. But the essence of existence we call God. Faith, post hoc after faith gives us a light to know better by, yes. As St. Augustine said, I believe in order to understand, but also I work to understand better, the better to believe. So faith, this decision, yes, this intentionality of assent, yes, is necessary to permit the concept of God, let alone the reality of God or the possibility of God, to give itself to thought. If I don't leave room for even the possibility of divinity, I'll never encounter it. But divinity, by definition, is something, again, entirely other than anything else I'm dealing with in my lived experience. So how do I let it in? How could I be more hospitable to divinity, even in philosophy? To leave the door open. That's required. What we call faith, this assent to the possibility of divinity to begin with, is at the outset. If I say I'm not going to to give divinity that much room, to give itself to me? Well, the door is closed. And that's another kind of intentionality we call doubt, we call skepticism, and all this. So yes, we try to weed out bias of different kinds. But if we want to call faith a bias, what a happy bias it is. Because it gives us access to the greatest potencies of love and ethics and the possibilities of resurrection. When something terrible happens in your life, and you have no power to pick yourself up, you're in despair. Is there an elsewhere that can assist you, that can help you out? Divinity, God. And Pascal's wager, Blaise Pascal says, all of us are in the same boat. None of us can put God and his kingdom on the table before another, but none of us can just brush him off either. We're all in the same boat between faith and doubt. So why not wager that God exists and see how life goes? That's a beautiful invitation. What a beautiful experiment to consider the possibility, not just that God exists, but that God loves me, that God loved me into being, desires to love me into eternity, and that because God loved me into being, his love will never let me go out of being. What if I live like this? The possibilities are endless. The possibilities of love, of mercy, of responsibility, of forgiveness, of forgiving even oneself. Because the self does not bear its utmost capacities to even deal with itself. To read the phenomenology of Jean-Luc Marion, the self needs the other. And the radical other for thought is divinity. It always has been, it always will be. So why not let divinity come into my thought and let it be thought in me? And maybe even then I'll be in a better place to judge whether or not I believe in this God, because I've taken time to get to know him. And how do I get to know him? By how he reveals himself, by how this God reveals himself to us over the course of human history. And yes, we have something to learn from all the great world religions. Above all, I myself, from my personal testimony, have found Catholicism, the Judeo-Christian tradition, to be true in every way. That meets my experience like a hand in a glove. That deals both with transcendence and immanence, with exteriority and interiority, with plurality and unity. All of these major philosophical concepts we find in the Judeo-Christian tradition, in this ethical monotheism that is even beyond a strict monotheism in Christianity, with the self-revelation of God as a trinity of persons. How can I say yes or no to this God unless I take some time to get to know this God as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit? And where will I get to know him? In his church. And yes, we can have bad experiences in the church, in the community we call the church, very terrible experiences. I would not deny that. I would not deny that I've had a fair share of my own. But what do I find again and again? The truth with a face and a name. His name is Jesus. And this is God become human for us and for our salvation. And I might as well get to the punchline of all of this philosophical investigation. What is most satisfying is the relationship with this God, who is not just a theoretical concept, but alive. And because this God is alive, I am alive. You are alive. We are alive. We get to do life because in the beginning is not death. We have the privilege of being persons because in the beginning is not impersonal atoms. In the beginning is a personal, alive, good God that is being itself and that holds this whole contingent, ephemeral, feeble universe, holds it in being because of love. Love is revealed in Jesus as the very rationality of being. Why is there something rather than nothing? Because this something has to do with love. Why bother otherwise? So, we come up on many paradoxes. And, um, you know, we have a checkered history as human beings, and none of us can deny that. And yes, religion and politics can get intermingled and it can get violent. But we don't need to lay the blame at the doorstep of religion over and over again. Religion, as a concept, comes from the Latin religare, where we get the English word ligament. What binds something together? What we hold to be of ultimate concern. And each one of us, with our various backgrounds and points of view, holds something to be of ultimate concern. Each one of us worships something or someone. It could be oneself. It could be so-called science, whatever one understands by that term. It could be matter. It could be Mother Nature, the universe, God. Which God? Depends on how we understand God's revelation. There's a truth about God. And yes, when we do comparative theology, there's contradictions. So when we take, for example, is there one God or many gods? It's one or the other. It's one or the other. And reason shows us it doesn't make sense to say that we have many gods because the divinity or the infinity of divinity is lost in the multiplication of the deity. So divinity must be simple, not divisible into different individual gods. That doesn't make any sense rationally. So it's irrational. Polytheism is irrational. So monotheism makes the most sense in terms of the nature of divinity. But then once philosophy establishes, yes, God exists, that God exists, then we wonder, who is this God? We are whose. It stands to reason that God also is who. God is personal. It makes no sense to say that we are personal, but God is not. No. So we have something to do with a personal God. And we need to let God speak well about God through God's revelation, through manifestation, through events, and also through word communication, proclamation. And the Judeo-Christian tradition, for instance, has a coherent logic of how the self-revelation goes through the Jewish people, all the way into Jews and Gentiles alike with Christianity. This most inclusive summons to salvation we have here. So we have a lot of great interaction through the chat, and thank you for your participation. And again, if something is in the imagination, where did it come from? The imagination, as Immanuel Kant says, cannot produce something from nothing. So there's a givenness about God, and if we reckon with that sheer fact of the data of divinity, we're stuck with dealing with it. So we can't pretend like it is not given itself. It has once and for all. And so as humanity, we, like Jacob, called Israel in the Hebrew scriptures, we wrestle with divinity. We wrestle with the concept. We ask so many questions. Why? We ask of God so many things, as we should. And the fact that we raise the questions suggests the answer that precedes them. Otherwise, we would not raise the questions. So, yes, I subscribe to biological evolution, evolutionary theory. Even the Hebrew scriptures narrate as much as Genesis chapter 1 that God creates in a succession of moments. And we don't, we're not fundamentalist about the biblical text. In Catholicism, it's very mythological and symbolic and figurative. But at the same time, it reveals something very precise, historical, factual about God and how God creates. So in Catholicism, we gather up all the evidence, and we don't want to amputate any form of evidence. We want to gather all of it up to deal with the whole. We want to put it all in conversation, all in dialogue. In the thing, in philosophy and theology, we will refuse the most to dispense with is something like love, something like personhood, something like ethics, responsibility for the other. All of these things, we found the pearl of great price, to put it in the words of Jesus, and we give up everything we have to possess this pearl and all that it gives. I don't know what rivals love. I think it's time to get out some dollar bills. Does this rival love? This money, material possessions, even knowledge, even certainty, even empirical proof? Does this rival love? One can call me a Don Quixote. One can call me delusional. But at the end of the day, what I want to do with more than anything else is love. It's what I want to live for, and it's what I want to die for. Not money, not things, not epistemological certainty. In philosophy, certainty itself is rather illusory. Descartes shows us as much with his cogito, ergo sum. But I seek not a certainty, but an assurance about meaning, meaningfulness, an integrity of being, of personhood. I recognize I have been summoned not just to live for myself, but to live for the other person who faces me. And she is not reducible to atoms. If I told my wife, Megan, that, she would be very upset. If she told me that, you are a bunch of atoms. Atoms don't love each other. Spirits do. Persons do. This is what we're dealing with in our lived experience. We need not be fooled by rationalism that has run its course and has taken a nosedive into the ground over and over again. We need to let reason be expanded by the dimensions of the intentionality of faith that has something to do with God and God's revelation, lest our reason implode on itself. This is what's at stake. Atheism, I love the concept because theos is in it. We can't peel away. There's no term for the human being that doesn't have to do with God. If atheism is our best one, we need to find some other term that doesn't include theos in it. But atheism itself is a great paradox. And atheism has a purpose to deny, as we should, all of the idols of divinity. This is not God, that is not God. Atheism has a role to play. Yes, I don't believe that money is God. I don't believe that the state is God. I don't believe that success is God or fame is God, or I don't believe that I am God. I don't believe that the devil is God. I don't believe that any creature is God. I don't believe that the universe is God. Yes, I'm atheism in this respect. I'm an atheist in the face of polytheism. In fact, the Christians in the early church were called by the Roman state atheists. So I'm not afraid of the word of atheism at all. I think it's great. I'm an atheist in so many respects. But because I am an atheist, I believe. And in fact, I believe in God. I believe in God all the while I might protest against God, if this is what I mean by atheism. I have something to do with God because God had something to do with me. Otherwise, I wouldn't exist. So, no, God for mystical theology is beyond being also, is beyond what we think we know existence means. And this is a rational move to make because, as St. Augustine says, if I comprehend it, it is not God. So God is not just a limit concept for thought. God is a saturating concept for thought. And though I can't circumscribe God with a thought, I can still let God reveal himself to me. Just like I can't circumscribe you by a thought. You're a person. You're not an object. You're not just a random network of atoms, anatomy and physiology. You are a human being. You have soul. You have personhood. You have a name. And so, no. Yeah, so this is what we're getting at. And I know I should wrap up our live stream for today. And I would encourage us all to keep thinking further. Let the whole give itself to us and think about the difference between person and product, the difference between observer and object, the difference between sacred and secular, and that we live at this intersection of personal, spiritual being and material being as soul and body. This we'll continue to talk about, again, taking a lot of my reflections from my 2017 book, Human and Divine Being, a study on the theological anthropology of Edith Stein. Yes. So it takes humility to let God be thought in the self, and not reduce God to somehow filling in the gaps. If there's gaps of knowledge, this is what we like in philosophy, a gaping inquiry, living into the questions. We don't even just seek to fill them, because to say I filled them means I move on to other gaps. God doesn't just fill the gaps. God, we could say, provokes them, and including the gaps of empiricism. This is what we want. When we're dealing with the absolute, it is paradoxical because God is at the same time concealed and revealed. Deus obsconditus, Deus revelatus. And so God himself doesn't fill in the gaps of the concept, but provokes thought to stretch further into absolute being, eternal being, where love is made in as much as it is given. Thank you so much for thinking along with me today. I love it very much. Hope we have another rendezvous coming up. I'll be on the live stream sometime tomorrow. So if you're not already a subscriber, I invite you to subscribe. You can make comments in the comment section. I ask that everyone just be respectful of each other, and we don't want to fall into trolling and this kind of thing online because it serves no purpose. So what we want is sincere, respectful dialogue in the platform, and I think for the most part we've had that today. So thank you so much for that. May we all continue to think toward the whole, to pray from the heart, and to live as a witness. We'll see you in the next one.